Good morning. My name is Garrett Beers. I'm a DCNR service forester. DCNR stands for Department of Conservation Natural Resources. We manage, that's Bureau of Forestry, we manage 2.2 million acres of state forest land throughout the state of Pennsylvania. As a service forester, I primarily work with private forest landowners like yourselves, anything from large hunting clubs, large private landholders, all the way down to the smaller homeowner that has a question about one or two trees in their yard. My personal area that I cover is both Monroe and Pike County in my position. So a lot of people ask me, big thing is, what is killing my tree? That can be anyone, again, from a large landowner that has big gypsy moth outbreak, disease, something like along the lines of that, all the way down to somebody that has just one or two trees in their yard, landscape type setting, has questions. Hey, what's wrong with my tree? I'm noticing some issues and looking for some more information to at least get some more information for their own knowledge, or to look at more of a treatment procedure to kind of get those trees back to health. I'm going to go over some of the main questions, kind of like issues that I see most commonly with homeowners and general landowners in our area. I'm not going to be able to cover everything that you're going to see on your trees, but it's a pretty good overview of a lot of the stuff that I see on my day-to-day basis, and a lot of the questions that I get asked are going to be in this presentation as well. Okay, so tree issues. Keeping trees healthy is a lot easier than trying to fix a problem once it starts. Again, like your body, it's a lot easier to maintain good health than it is to try to fix a problem, a health issue that would arise from having, say, unhealthy life, things to that nature. Diagnosing a specific tree issue is very hard once a tree has died. You lose a lot of the indicators you would see on a tree, whether it be a fungal disease on the leaves, frost damage. Those sorts of things go away as the tree dies, branches fall off. You start to lose a lot of that evidence that you'd have from tree disease or also from any kind of insect attack. That stuff is gone. It's really hard to make a determination what killed the tree. Another thing some landowners think is trees will not come back to health once they die. Once a tree dies, it's dead. It's not going to revive itself. Sometimes you will see a tree sprout from the root system back when you have a pathogen or a insect or disease kills the above ground section. That's pretty common, but once a tree is completely dead, it's not going to resprout ever again. One thing I always say is when the average person that's not involved in landscaping, nursery industry, forestry, when they notice the tree has a problem health-wise, it's usually too late. Usually the symptoms at that point are very far along, the tree's really declining in health, and it's really at a point where you're not gonna be able to bring that tree back to good health. Another thing is trees do not heal like our body does. Once a wound is on the tree, it's always going to be there. You just won't see it, because what a tree does, it actually grows new bark and new wood over the damaged area. So if you back your truck into the tree, knock the bark off it, eventually the tree is going to grow new wood over top of it and bark, and you won't see that damage. That damaged area is always going to be in that tree, provide an area where you could probably get some rot in there eventually, and maybe some structural problems as well in the future. Okay, one of the big issues we're having now with trees, a lot of homeowners are seeing, is what is known as emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is a non-native insect that was introduced into the Great Lakes states, Michigan, and southern Canada in 2002 when it was first discovered. One thing about emerald ash borer, only attacks our ash species. Primarily here in Pennsylvania, we just have white, black, and green ash. There's some other subspecies that are found around the country, but those are the three big ones we have here in Pennsylvania. Most commonly in Monroe and Pike County, we primarily have white ash growing natively, but you could possibly find some of the black ash and green ash growing in a landscape type setting. The trees almost look identical. It really takes somebody with a lot of experience to be able to identify the different subspecies. So again, the emerald ash borer, the adult lays its egg on the outside of the tree's bark. The egg then hatches, the little larva comes out and burrows its way between the bark in the cambium layer between the bark and the wood, And then inside there, the larva grows and it feeds on that cambium layer as its nutrients. And then eventually what happens is it girdles a tree in essence. Best way to describe girdling is the small vessels that transport nutrients up and down inside the tree. Those connections are broken, no different than if you cut yourself, where your blood cannot flow between your vessels and eventually you would bleed out and die. That's kind of how it works in the ash trees as well. The mortality rates of ash trees is 99%. It's actually higher than that. Almost all the ash trees are going to die. It's not a matter of if your tree is going to die, it's a matter of when. They're finding some places what they're calling lingering ash trees, which after 4 or 5 years, after majority of the trees have succumbed to emerald ash borer, they're finding a few trees that are still hanging on. We're not sure if there's a genetic resistance to the ash borer on those trees, or if they're just one of the kind of law of averages where eventually a couple of trees are going to get missed. Here, the outlook in Monroe and Pike County, probably within the next 4 to 5 years, probably all the ash trees are going to be dead. You're seeing very heavy mortality of the ash trees in southwest Monroe County, western Pike County, and eventually it's going to keep working to the east and envelop both of our counties. You can do some chemical treatments on ash trees to prevent them dying from emerald ash borer, but they are very, very expensive, and they're going to have to be treated every probably 2 years or so for the treatment. Again, very expensive and a long-term commitment. It's not a one-time vaccine to help them. It's going to have to be repeated treatments throughout the tree's life. The upper left-hand corner, you can see some white ash, very common what you're going to see around here. You see the canopies very sparse as the tree declines in health. See a few branches in the upper left-hand corner. That ash tree still alive, but eventually that tree's probably not going to leaf out the next spring. Then the lower image is what you're seeing a lot of times on these ash trees. You're seeing the bark. It looks more like a salmony pinkish color. And what that is, there's actually woodpeckers that are trying to feed on the larvae themselves, and they're actually pulling off the outer bark. And that's why you see that pink type look of the bark. Very common. You see it all over now driving around. And in 2-3 months, that bark will actually turn a lighter tannish, or I should say more of a grayish color when it starts to fade out from the sun. Kind of gives it a camouflaged look and color. But you're seeing this all over residential yards, street trees, all the way to woodlands. It's very, very widespread. Next thing you see a lot, it's another non-native species we have here in Pennsylvania, is what is known as Hemlock woolly Adelgid. Primarily that infects our eastern hemlock trees, which are very common around this area. All the stream drainages have them along the streams, north-facing slopes, very, very common tree species. The insect itself actually overwinters in little white cotton ball shaped mass on the bottom side of the needles. Inside that, the larva will actually feed, the adelgids will actually feed on the sap from the needles. Pretty much acts like a parasite. As it sucks the nutrients out of the needles, eventually the tree will decline in health over the course of 10, 15, 20 years. Then usually the tree dies as a result. As the infestation goes on farther, you'll see the tree start to lose its deep, dark green color that's very characteristic of the hemlock. And eventually it turns to more of a greenish yellow. The canopy thins, and then eventually the tree will die from the feeding of the insects, or possibly, since the tree is stressed, a new pathogen will move in and then kind of like a 1-2 punch kind of knock the tree out, and they're eventually going to die. One of the best ways to actually prevent, or I should say treat, Hemlock woolly Adelgid is what is known as a soil drench method. There's a product which is known as imidacloprid. It's very easy to obtain. You can buy it easily online. Most of the home and garden centers will have it. It's very cheap. You mix up the chemical according to the label rates. You pretty much just apply it to the soil in a liquid mix with water. The tree uptakes the material, and then it can give you control over 5 years if you just have the woolly adelgid problem themselves. Works very effectively, very cheap. Last time I ran the numbers on the imidacloprid treatments, you can get the chemical for about 30 cents per inch of tree diameter. So a tree that's 20 inches in diameter, you can treat that tree for $6. That's pretty darn cheap. It's a treatment you can do yourself. And again, if you're going to get 3-5 years of control, a little bit longer out of it, you're talking a tree that you can treat for $1 to $2. Very, very cheap treatment. It's not something I'd want to do on a whole forest-wide basis. But again, if you have one or two, even a dozen high-value trees, maybe along your stream, along your pond, next to your house, things like that, it's a very, very good investment. Very easy to do. Your general homeowner can do it without very much knowledge in chemical application and forestry. Another issue we see very commonly on the hemlocks also, which is known as hemlock, elongated hemlock scale. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as hemlock scale for short. Again, it's another non-native invasive species. Kind of works the same way almost as the Hemlock woolly Adelgid, where the scale insect actually feeds on the needles themselves and pulls the nutrients out of the needles and eventually stresses the tree out to a point where the tree will actually die. It's easy to identify. You simply flip over the hemlock branch just like you would for Hemlock woolly Adelgid, and you'll see these orangish type looking, kind of looks like a scab you get over type of cut growing in the bottom side of the needles. And that's actually the scale insect themselves. They actually build a protective case over them and kind of protects them from the elements and predators, and they'll actually then feed on the needles. So in all those little raised orange scales, there's actually an insect in there that's actually feeding. Scale's a little bit more complex to treat than Hemlock woolly Adelgid. If you try to treat for woolly Adelgid and you have scale present, you do not want to use that imidacloprid. Imidacloprid's in a class of insecticides that actually will pick up and kill some of the beneficial insects that will prey on scale. So if you treat with imidacloprid, you'll lose some of those insects that prey on the scale, which will then make your scale problem worse. If you have Hemlock woolly Adelgid and elongated hemlock scale, you're going to want to treat with a product which is known as dinoteffuron. Again, it's a chemical that's a little more expensive. You can treat the same way with a soil injection, but again, you'll get some pretty good coverage for both species. I've been involved in treatments where we treated both for Hemlock woolly Adelgid and elongated hemlock scale using dinoteffuron. It's an awesome process. You treat the trees, you can come back in the stand 3-4 years later. The trees will have a nice dark green canopy. You can easily pick out the trees that were treated just by looking at their crowns. You see the healthy trees that were treated, they're thicker, denser, you don't see as much sunlight filtering through, and the hemlocks have a nice, healthy, dark green look. You look at the trees that were not treated, they have a yellow, chlorotic, really sickly look, sparse canopy. The difference is night and day. Again, if you're going to want to treat your trees, the sooner you start the treatment process, the better. The healthier trees you start with, the better prognosis you're going to have to pull out, regain some strength, and keep continuing growing in a healthy manner. You can treat trees down to about 40% of crown dieback pretty easily and bring them back to health. Once you start getting crown dieback, that starts to go to that 50% range. It's very hard to bring the tree back to health just because it's been beat down so far. You probably have other pathogens now that moved into the tree that's stressed. And again, as soon as you can treat the tree, the healthier it is, the better results you're going to have in the long run. Okay, blue spruce issues. This one is a very, very big topic. Historically, blue spruce were planted very widely in the nursery industry. They're all over in a landscape type setting. They're a beautiful tree when they're healthy. Deer don't browse them. Really nice blue color. Very nice looking tree. Unfortunately, here the last 10, 15 years, we're having some issues with two different needle cast diseases with them. One is Rhizophyra needle cast, and one is Stigmata needle cast. They're both fungal diseases that infect the needles. They like to propagate in these really cool, wet climates we've been having, especially in the springtime. And again, throughout the summertime, we have these real high humidity days, a lot of times 80, 90% humidity. And for fungal diseases, they love to have those wet conditions. It really propagates them and keeps exacerbating the problem. Only real way to treat this is repeated applications of fungicide on a yearly basis. A lot of these fungicides you might have to apply 3-4 times in the course of a growing season, well spaced, 2 weeks apart. It's a very, very in-depth process. Again, it's one thing to treat a tree that maybe is under that 8-foot mark. Once you start getting a lot of these older trees that are 15, 20, 30 feet, trying to get the material up into the canopy for adequate coverage is pretty darn impossible for most homeowners. One of the best things you can do to do like a cultural treatment to keep these trees healthy, or to say healthier, is if you can prune the bottom branches off the bottom couple feet as the tree gets larger. What that'll do is you'll get better airflow. It'll get rid of the shading on the ground. Things will get a chance to dry out, which will reduce the amount of humidity that's around that tree. That'll help you out in the long run. Also, again, move those lower branches that are heavily infested. It's going to break the chain of producing spores, which then can get on the new growth moving forward to kind of reduce the chances that the new needles become infested. One of the other things to do is if you're going to plant blue spruce, even if you don't see signs of needle cast, you still want to use that fungicide treatments just to knock out any kind of spores that may make their way from neighboring trees to your trees. Other thing you can do is plant blue spruce in a nice area, meaning fairly decent soils, the tree's not stressed from water, excess water in the ground, drought. And again, if you get a lot of sun in the trees, nice airflow with the wind, it's going to work out very good, just lowering the chances that you're going to get an infestation. Big issue here is keeping the plants dry is a huge one. I really don't recommend homeowners planting blue spruce. If you're going to want to replace them, go with something like a white spruce or a Norway spruce. They're both species that are more adapted to a wetter, more damp climate. They both do very well here, excellent growth characteristics, very healthy trees, both the white spruce and the Norway spruce as well. And again, they're both widely available in the landscaping nursery trade. Another tree that was planted pretty heavily in the landscape type setting over the years is Douglas fir. There's two main issues with those. What's known as rab decline, and the other one is known as Swiss needlecast. They're both working the tree fairly similarly. They attack the second-year-old needles. Needlecast disease as well, just like the Rhizophora and stigmata needlecast and the blue spruce. Really like to have those wet, damp environments to really propagate. Our weather here in Pennsylvania, especially the last 3-4 years, very wet springs really lead to the propagation of both these diseases. Rab decline and Swiss needlecasts a lot of times are found together on the same tree. Loss of second-year needles. And again, you're talking the fungicides to control the rab decline and Swiss needlecast, just like the issues with blue spruce. Douglas fir, they're very widely planted in the nursery industry for cut trees for Christmas time, but do not make a good tree for a landscape type setting that you're going to try to grow for long term. It doesn't work. Even in the nursery industry, Swiss needlecast and rab decline is a real pain to work with in a plantation type setting. It's very hard to get out once it's established. The other common issue we have with some of our planted conifers is what's known as white pine weevil. It's very, very common in white pine, especially white pines that are grown in a sunny environment, an old field that's reverting to forest, or one that's planted in a landscape type setting. We got plenty of sun. The weevil, what it does, it overwinters in the ground. In the springtime, it comes out, climbs all the way up to the highest point of the tree, and it'll actually lay eggs in the bud tip. What'll happen is those eggs will eggs will grow or hatch, form a little larva, and that larva will then feed down into the tree vertically, and they'll keep feeding inside the bark. They're going to all the way down. A lot of times, maybe 2 feet down, they'll feed, kill off all that new growth. They'll turn to adults, go back into the soil, and repeat the process year after year. Generally, white pine is the favorite thing it attacks, but it will also attack some of our fir species and spruce. You'll find it in Norway spruce, Serbian spruce, blue spruce to a limited extent. You'll see it in Douglas-fir as well, but primarily white pine is its main host. This is not a fatal disease, or I should say, not a fatal attack from an insect. What it's just going to do is kill the top bit of growth, and then the side branching, which is known as lateral branching, is going to then turn upright and try to become a new leader. And that's why you see a lot of trees in the woods. The white pine, you'll see they'll go up maybe 10 feet. The trunk will split into 3-4 different stems. Some of those stems may go up, maybe they're 10, 15, 20 feet, and they'll split again. That's just evidence of old needle or weevil damage where it killed the leader, and the side branches turned up, making a new, trying to make a new leader to continue growth vertically to kind of keep the tree alive. Health-wise, long-term, it doesn't have really any effect on the tree itself. It's still going to grow healthy, but where the damage really occurs is in the timber value, where if you're trying to like manage timber financially speaking, where you would like to have a tree that has big, one wide, straight stem, the weevils get in there, and pretty soon you make all these multi-stems, small diameter. It's not really worth anything at that point. One of the easiest ways to deal with this is you have a tree in your yard, to simply go, when you see what's known as a shepherd's crook here, you'll see the branches at the top of the leader, they'll start to wilt, fall over and brown like you see in the upper left-hand corner photo here. If you take a hand clipper, simply go down, keep following it down until you get to healthy tissue where you don't have any of the tunnels from the weevil. You cut all that out, dispose of the top section, preferably burn it or dispose of it in the trash. That way you kind of get rid of the new. If you just simply cut the top off, throw it in the ground, those weevils could possibly still go through the life cycle, get in the ground, and then reappear the next spring. So if you can remove those, destroy the actual larvae that are inside there, you're way ahead of the game. You can simply then at that point take a string, you can tie over one of those lateral branches that are there, form a new leader, the tree will grow vertically. That's very common in the nursery industry to repair those damages. It's very simple to do. Another common thing we see kind of getting away from the conifers is what's known as black knot or cherry black knot. Very, very common on wild-grown black cherry, fire cherry, sweet cherry. And again, in your more of a landscaping horticultural section, a lot of our ornamental flowering cherries, plums. You also see this too, getting on the stem versus the branches themselves. It's very, very, very common. You'll see it too if you have any like the sweet cherry, sour trees, cherry trees planted for like an orchard setting. You will find this. Black knot is a fungal disease itself. It causes both not only aesthetic damage but also economic when it gets on the stem itself. Behind the black knot area, what it's doing is it's causing damage to the tissue. It's growing callus tissue there. You're going to get some decay behind it. What'll happen if you get a big giant growth on the main stem, which you get big windstorm, you get that hard area, dead material where it won't flex. You'll create a weak point in the tree itself, and the tree can easily snap off in an ice storm, a big windstorm. I'm sure everyone here has probably taken a live green branch they cut. You can twist it in a circle, it doesn't break, but you try that with a dead piece, the piece of wood is going to snap in half. That's kind of what happens there to black knot disease when it gets on the main stem. When black knot's in the main stem, you really don't have much choice just to let it there. You can't prune it out. Nothing like that's going to happen. Again, if you get the black knot on a smaller side branch, you can easily prune it out when it appears. You want to go 5-6 inches lower on the stem, closer towards the trunk, prune it out, make sure you got healthy wood there. We don't have any spores or new growth starting. It's the best way to do it. Stay on top of the trees, prune that stuff out as soon as you see it, dispose of it, and you'll kind of break that chain of reinfestations in other branches. Black knot is probably not going to kill your tree unless you get it on the main stem, where it could cause that tree to break in half in a windstorm. But in the branches, simply prune it out, and you should be good to go from there. Okay, here are some other things where you'll see pretty commonly, which is known as a stem canker. You'll find these very common, maples, oaks, you name it, you will find them out there. Fairly common in birch as well. Most of these are caused by a fungal pathogen that keeps reinfesting the tree. The tree tries to grow new wood and shut off the cells around the point of infection, but it's not able to keep up, and you'll see those bigger cankers. The upper photo on the left is a red maple tree. That canker's been there probably for decades. They're just getting larger. And then in the bottom right, you'll see some this is a scarlet oak. You'll see in the bottom, there's some swelling at the butt right next to the ground. And then a couple feet up on the left-hand side. Very common, you'll see those cankers there. Really no way to deal with those issues. If you're in a forestry type setting where those trees are usually selected for removal, in a thinning or shelter wood type sequence, just for the fact that you can kind of remove some of that pathogen from the stand, which could infect other trees, but also to trees like that, very susceptible to breakage and windstorms, very low quality. A lot of times there's rot inside there. So a lot of those trees are kind of selected for removal, the timber harvesting stands. I mean, they're pretty common. You'll find them all over the place. Usually not a big deal widespread, though I have saw one property in southwest Pike County where it seemed like every tree had those big cankers on in a small stand. But again, that's kind of an isolated case. Some other stuff we see very commonly is wildlife damage of all aspects. Woodpeckers, sapsuckers, chewing of bark from wood, or from rabbits, mice, voles, you name it, there's always something out there trying to feed on our trees. Something you see very commonly here, the upper left-hand corner, is damage from what's known as a yellow-bellied sapsucker. The tree is really not too damaged by it health-wise. What the sapsucker does, it actually just pecks little holes in the bark, a little bit of sap comes out, and then insects and things are attracted to that sap. Then the sapsucker comes back, and then it feeds those insects as a result. So the sapsucker is not feeding on the tree itself. It's just causing a little bit of damage, where then another insects come, they feed on it, and the sapsucker can come then feed on the insects. It's kind of setting a trap, so to speak, for the insects to feed. Again, the bottom right-hand corner there, you have some woodpecker damage, another bird damage. Usually woodpecker damage is not a result of just the woodpecker wanting to make a hole. Usually what's behind it is there's already some kind of insect that's in the bark, in the wood. There's decay there where insects are living, and the woodpecker simply comes there, then pulls apart the wood to find that underlying condition. I don't think you're really going to find a woodpecker just creating a cavity to nest in when there's so many places out there ready that it can go nest. Again, it's going to take a lot of work to make a cavity pecking through solid wood. So usually you'll see it in trees that already have an issue going on. The woodpecker is kind of just pointing out that issue when as they're trying to feed. Kind of mentioned porcupine damage and chewing. This is extremely common in the wintertime. You'll see a lot of times the teeth marks underneath against the wood as the porcupine chews off the outer bark to feed. Very, very common here. You'll see it in all our stream drainages, anywhere you have hemlock, spruce, white pine. The porcupines go up there in the wintertime, feed on the bark. It's very, very common. It's usually not going to cause a tree mortality, but I have saw it where they have girdled whole trees where they're feeding on isolated trees and killed the tree as a result. Most of the time you'll see them, they'll kill off upper branches, at least some of the finer branches off, but a lot of times it's not going to kill the tree, but they can cause some very, very extensive damage when they isolate and feed on a few trees at one time. A lot of times you'll see the porcupine damage, you look up in the tree, You'll see the bark chewed off. Another thing you'll see is on the ground, you'll find little pieces of branches, little pieces of wood the porcupine dropped. Usually you look up in the tree, you'll see more damage above you. A lot of times you'll even find the porcupine up in the tree. It's not really a good way to prevent a porcupine from eating your tree. There's a porcupine hunting season, so you might want to take advantage of that if you have a real bad porcupine issue. And again, if you have a bad porcupine issue, a lot of times you'll find them feeding on other things. They love feeding on any kind of pressure-treated deck. They love chewing on that sort of things. You will find them chew on anything that has salt on them. They love in like at lease camps and hunting camps, like outhouse seats, tool handles, things like that has salt on them from sweat. They love chewing on that kind of stuff. Another thing you'll find them chewing on too is aluminum. You'll find it on all those different things as well, besides just your conifer species. One thing we see pretty commonly around here on the springtime is frost damage. I get a lot of calls. I got a bunch of calls this past spring here where a lot of our species started to push out new growth in the spring. It's one of the dangerous things about getting those really warm springs in March, April. You get that late frost going into the later part of May sometimes. When all the trees have their new growth out, can cause some very extensive damage. The upper left-hand corner, you can kind of see some deformed leaves, also some brown leaves curling as a result of a late frost after some red oak buds came out. Other thing on the bottom right, you'll see a lot of times, that's a Douglas-fir. Douglas-fir are break bud very soon in the spring, very tender. And what you'll see is this picture here, they pushed out new growth, maybe 2-3 inches. You got that late frost. It killed off that new growth. Most of the time, the trees will grow out of frost damage unless it be very, very severe damage. Your conifers are going to be hit the hardest on it just for the fact that they can't produce new buds like a hardwood tree can. So whatever buds a conifer tree makes the previous year is what's going to grow the next spring, and nothing additional. They're not like a oak or a maple. If you prune it, where a new bud will come out. It's not going to happen in a conifer, unless you're talking about a pitch pine, which is a whole unique, different story. Frost usually won't kill a tree, so to speak, but it can add a secondary stressor. Kind of works almost like a defoliation will, where a tree pushes out new growth, the new growth's killed off, and really zaps a lot of nutrients out of the tree's root system and really reduce its ability to make energy through photosynthesis. Both very common in the spring. Will cause a lot of damage in a nursery type setting with a landscape type trees you're trying to produce. Also, again, you're trying to grow fruit in an orchard, very, very damaging. I have friends that own a big orchard. This past spring here, they lost most of their apple trees in one of these late frosts. Late frost can be a real giant pain to deal with. And it's very common. Every few years, you're going to get that late frost going into May, and you're going to have some damage. Another thing I see pretty commonly with trees issues is resulting from improper tree planting. People buy trees from a nursery type setting. They just throw them in the ground. A lot of times the tree is buried too deep. It's not going to go good. The tree's root system needs to have oxygen from the above ground area, from the air going down through the ground in the pores. And if those roots do not have that oxygen supply, they will die. Other thing with burying them too deep is around the trunk, you keep moisture there, which can cause rot and decay. Another thing that'll happen too is the tree's buried, they'll actually start to produce roots from the side of their trunk, known as advantageous roots. It's not a good situation, and it causes a lot of issues in the future. Other thing you plant trees is you don't want to put fertilizer in the hole with them. That granulated fertilizer is so concentrated that what will happen, you can actually burn off the new roots that are pushed out, burn off the root tips and do some serious root damage when you put fertilizer in the hole. Best way to do a fertilizer is plant your tree so that the root flares even with the ground around it, and then you can put fertilizer on top of the ground because it'll slowly get brought into the ground when as it rains slowly like that. It's not going to be a big concentrated impact on this small little root system at one time. Again, another thing with tree planting is pick a tree that matches the location. Don't say that you have the space you want to grow a dogwood. What you want you to do is figure out the space that you have there and say, hey, what's a tree that I like to grow in that area, whether it be the amount of sunlight, the amount of shade, soil compaction, how wet is the area, how dry is it, how close is it to overhead power lines. All those things taken into account will save you a big pain in the future where you have a tree now that's too big for the site. It's lifting your sidewalks, it's interfering with your gutters, it's underneath your power lines, the power company's going to have to prune. All those issues are going to be things you have to deal with in the future. So again, if you want a tree with say a white flower, look at the site and say what tree of the white flower will meet that site. Or maybe you won't find a tree that meets that site. Maybe you've got to reevaluate what you'd like to plant there, because it's going to save you a giant headache in the long run. You see it all over. You see somebody with a 120-foot Norway spruce planted 8 feet from their house. It's not a good site for it. It can be some foundation issues with it. Can cause some roof issues too, with the roof being shaded and moss growing on it. So you want to pick appropriate tree for appropriate site. Another thing with trees you'll see a lot that people plant is what is known as girdling roots. These are roots that are growing in a circle or growing over top of each other very heavily. What that does is as the roots get larger and expand, they're actually going to grow into each other and choke themselves out. This is very common in containerized stock you can get from a nursery, where you go there and get a tree maybe in a 1 or 2 gallon, 3 gallon pot. If the tree is grown in that pot for too long, the roots will grow out as they get larger, hit the outside of the pot, and they'll start to turn in a circular direction, which is what you're seeing here in this photo. The issue is not going to get better over time. It's just going to keep getting worse and worse as those roots get larger. Those girdling roots is going to lead to very, very poor tree growth, possibly mortality in the future. Best way to get in front of this is inspect the trees that you buy from a nursery. You want trees that don't have these girdling roots to start. Other thing you can do is, if you have trees that have this starting, you can take a saw, you can cut the girdling root, let it go, let it die on its own. You can do that. It's fairly common. The other thing you can do is, you get a containerized plant from a nursery, is take a knife. You can score the outside of the roots from the outside of the pot before you plant the tree. And also, again, you can cut an X across the bottom of it as well. What that's going to do is going to kind of break some of those root connections. That way the tree then can start to push new growth out into the surrounding soil once it's planted. Girdling roots are one thing that it's unfortunately very common, and it leads to a long-term, tree with poor health. It's not going to get better over time. Another thing I see is people have issues with trees. It's kind of referred to as mulch volcanoes, where for whatever reason people decide that you're supposed to pile mulch 2-3 feet up in a giant mound around a tree. Personally, I think it looks absolutely horrible. And again, you're going to have a lot of issues in the future. Now the tree is in essence buried too deep. It's going to produce roots higher up the stem. Also, again, you're going to have a place there where you're going to have excessive moisture around the tree's trunk, which can lead to rot and decay in the future. Those big piles of mulch can lead to animals, insects, home they can live. Again, they can then feed on the tree themselves, chew the bark, those sorts of things. So you go to the lower photograph right there, you can kind of see a tree that used to have those big mulch volcanoes around it. You can see some girdling roots starting to wrap around the tree themselves. You see the roots that grew up higher on the stem that came out, exposed to the ground. Those roots are very stressed. They dry out, very warm, and then you're going to be left with a giant, pretty much a mound for the rest of the tree's life there in your yard, not going to be able to do anything with. Again, those roots that are out of the soil, easily to get damaged with lawnmowers, weed whackers, those sorts of things. Best thing to do with mulching is keep mulch 2 to 3 inches around the tree. Keep the mulch pulled back 2, 3, 4 inches from the trunk, so that way the trunk is free to grow. Those are all very important. Again, you want to bring that mulch out as far away from the tree as you can. Usually tree roots extend all the way to the outer edges of the tree's canopy. The farther you get that mulch out there, it's better for the tree. Grass scavenges a lot of nutrients, a lot of water from the tree's root system themselves, believe it or not. Again, the grass heats up pretty warm. It can do some damage to the roots that are in the ground. And again, if you have the mulch there, you're not going to mow there. You're going to reduce the soil compaction as well. Another thing you see all the time is construction damage, whether it be the upper left-hand corner where somebody backed a piece of equipment into that white oak there, knocked off the bark. A tree is probably never going to heal from that or grow new wood over it. It could just lead to decay in the future. And again, you probably have what is a beautiful tree there in some kind of a landscape type setting, and it's just going to have issues going forth in the future. Eventually probably become a hazard tree, decay, could possibly fail on a structure, person, a vehicle. And again, the tree's going to get removed. It's going to cost a whole ton of money to do that. And again, the tree is worth more in aesthetical value than a small 2-inch tree you're going to plant as a replacement. I'd rather have that big 20-inch white oak there than some little 3-4-inch maple tree in my yard. Again, another thing with construction damage is soil compaction. You keep driving over these root systems, what you do is you reduce the amount of soil pores that are there, so not as much oxygen can get to the root system from the above ground atmosphere down to the roots. There's a lot of damage there. Other thing, as you're compacting that soil, you're actually moving the smaller fine roots that are very important for scavenging nutrients and water from the soil. You can actually break those connections, which is going to cause long-term damage. And again, those small fine roots are more important than the larger structural roots. The larger structural roots more act to hold the tree stably in the ground and funnel nutrients and water up from the roots to the main stem. But those little fine roots are often overlooked, and they're the ones that do a lot of the actual scavenging for nutrients and water in the soil. Other thing you'll see is that a lot of people run underground utilities, whether it be anything from electric cable lines, all those sorts of things. They run lines for sewer, for water, natural gas, all those things, and they just dig a big trench and sever the entire root system on one side of a tree. The tree in the bottom corner there, you can say probably over a third of the root system is completely severed from that tree. That tree is most likely going to die as a result of that. You pretty much lost all the structural integrity on the left side of that tree, keeping that tree in the ground, any kind of windstorms. Other thing too is you lost the ability to scavenge nutrients and water from that side of the tree. It's not a good situation at all. And again, root systems hold a lot of the nutrients in the tree in its form of storage that the tree needs for the lean times, whether it be late frost damage to produce new leaves, defoliation. Those sorts of stored nutrients from the good days are also lost when that root system is broken and severed. The best thing you can do is, if you're trying to do any kind of work, build a house, develop a lot, if you want to keep a tree, think of that from the get-go. Protect that tree. Means fence it off so that you can't have any storage equipment there. Building materials, driving there, trenching, going to go a long way to tree health. One thing with construction damage, it might take 10, 15, 20 years to really see a lot of the damage really start to occur. I mean, the damaged tree trunk eventually is going to keep rotting, more decay, more decay, more decay, and pretty soon you have a giant cavity there. The trees with the severed root systems and issues with compaction, eventually you'll start to see that canopy start to die off. You'll see the fine branches die. They'll die back a little bit farther. Pretty soon you're going to start to see the heavy main branches die off. Sparse canopy gets more narrow and narrower over the course of 15, 20 years. And then you have an issue in your hands where your tree is going to die, and it's nothing you're going to do at that point to bring that tree back and revive it. Construction damage is very, very hard on trees. It's another one here, absolutely appalling to look at, is improper pruning techniques, especially something like which is known as, they'll call it topping, where they'll go around and they'll just hack the tree back to the larger branches to try to, their idea is to try to contain these trees. All you're doing is making a problem worse. You can see, they just mean this tree was probably, had a canopy 2 to 3 times the size of this, hacked it back to all these branches. What's going to happen now is the tree is going to produce new buds where those branches have been cut off. Those buds are going to have very, very poor attachment. They're not going to have very good unions where they're going to come out from the main stem. Extremely susceptible to breaking off in windstorms, ice storms. Again, you have all those exposed wounds of that tree. The tree is very stressed. Those wounds are not going to compartmentalize, heal over, stop the rot and decay. That rot and decay is going to keep going down farther and farther in the main stem. It's going to become a huge issue in the future. You look down lower places on the stem, halfway down, you can see some big old pruning wounds that never healed. So the tree is not in a very good shape, health-wise and physically, and you're just driving the tree down farther and farther towards death. This is a good example right here of pick the proper tree for the proper site. If you would have had a smaller, more compact tree there, you probably wouldn't have had this issue where people try to reduce the size of the tree itself. Instead of planting, this looks like maybe probably a big silver maple. Instead of planting a silver maple there, it might have been a great time for a redbud or a dogwood, something smaller. It maybe gets 15, 20 feet tall, smaller tree, not a tree that has the capabilities of getting 80, 100 feet tall. It's going to overtop both your sheds. Some planting here, some pre-planting 40 years ago, 50 years ago, probably would have been a lot better here. And again, if you have a tree that you know is going to get big, it's in a site you maybe shouldn't be, you keep at it with some regular pruning. I'm not saying topping, but good pruning, things that reduce the size of the canopy through reduction cuts, things to that nature. You'll have a healthy tree, but again, you'll kind of keep it more compact, but you can't start the pruning process at a tree that's 50 years old, 60 years old. It's better to do it late than never, but if you'd start to do that from the trees young, you could do some directional pruning and things to kind of keep trees from getting as large. This tree would have had some directional pruning when it was smaller, or any kind of pruning for that matter. You would have had those bigger leads coming off at 3-4 foot off the ground. You could have pruned those out, and you would have had a single stem tree instead of this giant monstrosity growing between somebody's patio, sidewalks, and looks like a garage and a shed. Some pruning would go a long way. Again, pruning, it's all about hiring a reputable person that has the expertise. Don't hire the person that just cheap tree removal, whatever they call themselves, with a ladder and a truck. Try to find out somebody that's a real professional in their craft. Someone that's like, it's what's known as ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, based individual. It's kind of a professional accreditation society where folks have to go through continuing education classes, reference checks, things of that nature. They're the better, more knowledgeable tree care folks you're going to find versus the guy that has a truck with a sticker and a chainsaw. That's not the person you want to really hire for long-term tree health pruning, based on what I've saw in my career. Another thing, this is a little bit change of pace here. What is not killing your tree? I get this all the time, tons of phone calls about lichens on people's trees. Sure, everyone saw it here. You get lichens growing on sidewalks, patios, trees, maybe an old piece of furniture outside, decking furniture. Lichen is not taking any kind of nutrients from your tree. It's not causing any damage. What's to speak. It's a lichen is a strange relationship between fungus and an algae. It forms this interdependent relationship on themselves. Without getting too much in the weeds, the best way you can describe it, they will grow in anything, whether it's rocks, sidewalks, trees, you name it. If there's a site that meets their needs, right amount of sunlight, moisture, growing conditions, they will colonize that site. They're actually a good sign of air quality. That's why we have a lot of them up here, really good conditions to grow them, some very good air quality. So the lichen is not killing your tree, just like any kind of moss you would see on there and growing in the base, which is very common on our white oaks. You'll find it a lot, wetter sites. Those are not causing any damage. It's not like a mistletoe that you will find growing out west on a tree or down south. The lichen is not feeding on the tree like a mistletoe will be. So the lichen is not an issue. It's completely natural out there. You'll find lichens probably in every tree out there growing. Very, very, very common. So that pretty much wraps up most of the issues that I see primarily in my calls with landowners, and especially a lot of the stuff from the general homeowners. Just concerned about their trees. I didn't cover things like gypsy moth, some of the other caterpillar species that foliate, because most people are fairly familiar with them. In a small time frame, you can't really cover everything that could be affecting your tree. If you see anything out there you don't really know what it is, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is here on the screen, along with my phone number. Reach out to me. I can, a lot of times I can identify some of this stuff by a photograph, but if not, I can come out there as time permits, swing in my travels, take a look at your tree issues, and give you a pretty good idea what the issue is, and if there's any kind of treatment, so to speak, that you can use to kind of alleviate your issues. One thing right now with the whole COVID-19 restrictions, I'm not allowed to meet with a private landowner right now for the foreseeable future. But if there's an issue, you can send me a photograph, give me a phone call, and I can see what I can do for you. Other thing is too, I can come out here, put you on a list, and when I'm allowed to go out and do field visits, I can go out and look at your issues. But again, there's a lot of things out there always affecting your tree. It's just one of those things. It's kind of like our body. We fight off a lot of pathogens every day. But same way with your tree, you're going to have a lot of things out there, whether insects, fungal diseases, things of that nature. You're going to have that kind of stuff out there, and you're always going to. But again, if you do some preemptive things and treatments to start it with, a lot of times you can get over those more serious issues. Oh yeah, feel free to reach out to me through email or give me a phone call, and I can see if I can come out there and diagnose your issues and give you a good way to go forward in treating them. Okay, thank you.